In today's video, I want to show you the 4 techniques every beginner miniature painter should learn first, and put them to use right away with today's model. As you can see, it's already being base coated. Now, base coating on its own isn't very exciting, and it is not something people usually talk much about. But there is an important lesson hidden in it, and we'll come back to that later. For now, let's start with the first technique most painters learn when starting out: washing. At its core, washing is very simple. It is just heavily diluted paint designed to flow into the recesses of a model, and create shadows and separation between details. But just because it is easy, it doesn't mean we cannot make mistakes. One of the most common issues you'll run into is paint pooling. You see, washes naturally want to flow downwards, so if you're not paying attention, you will often find dark stains forming towards the bottom of an area, usually around the feet, the lower edges of armor, or the underside of details. At the same time, being too careful can cause the opposite problem. If you don't apply enough wash, it won't settle properly into the recesses, and instead of defined shadows, you'll end up with a weak tint over the whole area. What I like to do is load a good amount of wash onto the brush and work one section of the model at a time. I let the paint move naturally, and if I see too much building up, I simply clean my brush, pick up the excess and move on. It is also important not to jump back and forth across the model. Once a wash starts drying, going back over it can easily leave tight marks or uneven finishes. Because washes flow downward, I also prefer to work from the top of the model towards the bottom. That way, I am less likely to end up with heavy pooling where I don't want it. And once I've gone around the entire model, I always take one last look before setting it aside to dry, just to make sure nothing has settled in a way I'll regret later. Once the wash is dry, it is very normal for the model to look a bit dull. Even though the wash mostly settled into the recesses, it will most likely also darken the raised areas a little. But that is not a mistake, it's just part of the process. The next step is to bring the brightness back where the light would naturally hit. And for textured surfaces like this armor, there is one technique that does this better than almost anything else: dry brushing. For dry brushing, a soft brush is a must, and makeup brushes work particularly well for this. To start, I load a small amount of paint onto the brush and then remove most of it against a non-absorbent surface. The goal is not to have wet paint on the brush, but just enough pigment left that it transfers when the bristles rub against raised details. Because the paint isn't flowing freely, it naturally avoids the recesses and only catches the edges and textures. Now, you'll often see people remove paint on a paper towel, and while that works, it also pulls moisture out of the paint. That can create a grainy finish, especially on smoother areas where those tiny particles become more visible. And that is why I recommend using a non-absorbent surface to unload your brush. As I'm dry brushing, I am also paying attention to the direction of my strokes. I try to move across the recesses rather than along them, brushing from top to bottom or side to side depending on the area. This helps prevent the bristles from digging into the recesses and covering up the shadows we created earlier. However, dry brushing is also a very messy technique, and it will catch surrounding areas even if you're careful. And this is where base coating comes back into the picture. Because I know I'll need to clean things up afterwards, I usually try to dry brush earlier in the process, before I move on to more precise work. That way, fixing mistakes is quick, or had I left the purple base coats for later, unnecessary. This doesn't mean dry brushing can't be controlled, but especially when you're just starting out, it is better to allow yourself to be messy first and tidy later. After cleaning up my base coats, I started working on highlights for some of the smaller details, like the leather. And this is a good moment to point out something important. The classic sequence of base coat, wash and highlight isn't a rule, it's just one approach. In many cases, you can base coat, add a highlight first and then apply a wash afterwards. Because the wash slightly tints the raised details as shown previously, it can help pull highlights and shadows together and create a more cohesive look. Understanding that flexibility is a big step in feeling more confident while painting. Moving on, let's talk about layering. Layering is simply the process of applying paint over paint, while still allowing some of the previous layer to remain visible. Each time you do this, you are building a transition rather than covering everything completely. On this model, I am using the cape to demonstrate that idea. I start from a darker base coat, which represents the shadows, and gradually work my way towards brighter tones where the light would hit. Each layer covers slightly less area than the one before it, and together they create the illusion of depth and volume. To make this work smoothly, the paint needs to be a bit more diluted than a base coat. That extra transparency helps the layers blend into each other instead of sitting on top like solid blocks of color. You can achieve this by either repeatedly layering the same semi-transparent color or by mixing intermediate tones between your base coat and your highlight color. Both approaches work. The difference is simply how much time you want to invest and how comfortable you are with color mixing. Nowadays, many modern paint ranges make this easier by grouping colors into families, so you can naturally step from a base color into a mid-tone and then a highlight. For this model, I am taking a slightly more challenging approach, building semi-transparent layers from a red and purple mix before finishing with smaller layers of pure red. Finally, the last technique I want to cover is edge highlighting. This technique focuses on placing your brightest color on the sharp edges of a model. Even though these highlights are very thin, they create a strong sense of definition and make the miniature read clearly from a distance. When edge highlighting, instead of dragging the tip of the brush along the edge, which requires a very steady hand, I recommend turning the brush slightly sideways. That way, the bristles naturally catch on the raised edge, and even if I apply a bit more pressure than intended, my brush tip is unable to move into the recesses. It's a simple adjustment, but it makes the edge highlights much more forgiving, especially when you're still building confidence with brush control. With that said, thank you for watching the video till the very end. And remember, none of these techniques are magic buttons. They are just tools. They only start to work when you give them a little time and a little patience. At first, they might feel awkward, slow, or even frustrating. But every time you use them, your hands learn something new. And one day, without even noticing, they start to feel natural. So don't worry about being perfect or fast. Just pick up a brush, try one of these on your next model, and let yourself enjoy the process, because every miniature you paint is one step forward.